focusing in May on modern evangelism. And with us this morning is Philip Martin and Paul Hammonds, and they know a lot more about this than I do. So I'm going to turn the conversation over to them mostly. And if you've got questions, feel free to send those in. I'll make sure that they get to see your questions, and I will force them to answer all of them. So why don't you guys introduce yourself? Paul, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you know and what you've done?
Sure. Well, what I know won't take long. Sure. I've been preaching at the Kimberly Church of Christ for the last year. I've been in a number of different secular jobs before that, including some for the last 3 or 4 years that have been marketing based. So I've been involved a lot in different things like web strategy and social media and search engine optimization. A lot of the fun marketing buzzwords that everybody hears. So I've been involved a lot in that, and I've kind of been trying, now that I'm starting to get my feet on the ground, to think a little bit in terms of how those things can apply to the things that we do, I guess, which is kind of what we're here to talk about today.
Paul. I'm Philip Martin. I preach, I teach, I do stuff like that. I've been evangelistically focused as a follower of Jesus since becoming a part of the kingdom of God. I think the first things that I did as a Christian were try to get other people to study with me. The first Bible study I hosted was on the campus of San Jose State University as a recent convert, and try my best to do my best since then. That's about 20 or more years ago. To do the math in my head, I think that first Bible study was actually 28 years ago. Digitally, and that speaking, I grew up in the beginning phases of making digital commodities be a thing. I did my first digital work on Video Toaster on Amiga. I've continued to be involved in producing quality visual media on various edges. Some of my production has been used for commercial work outside of evangelistic work, some photography and some graphic design. I built websites with ones and zeros, kind of, in the beginning parts of the internets. And now I refuse to do any of that. And if it's not WYSIWYG, I don't want to do it. When it comes to the narrowed focus of social media, I try to understand all of this as best as I can. And so I'll say a couple things really specifically. I don't have all the answers. It's a whole new medium. And so the general truth is nobody knows what they're doing in regards to proven result-based mechanics for teaching in a digital context. There are people who have more experience doing it, but the proven model of conversation doesn't have 2,000 years of background, where literary and face-to-face communication do have much longer reaches of experience. So with a lot of this, we're trying to figure out how to navigate through a major shift in communication. Things are a lot different. And we're going to talk right now, specifically in the realm of social media, which is a narrow niche. And I think I understand it, but then each day something new happens. People have questions about anything and everything. I'm always open to giving answers, whether you like them or not.
So I guess maybe the first thing that we would want to talk about to kind of help people understand what do we even mean if you're going to talk about social media evangelism. What do you mean when you use that phrase, social media? What is it, and how does it apply to a church?
Paul, you want to have a structure for who goes first in this business?
I don't know, but since I haven't talked in 10 minutes, so no. I think it's exactly what it says. I mean, the idea of social media evangelism. Social media is about evangelism. I mean, that is what social media is there for. That's at its core. Social media is evangelizing. 90% of the time, it's evangelizing about myself. My life, my experiences, what interests me, what I think is great, what causes that I love, and what things I follow. It is theoretically, you should be able to look at somebody's social feed and understand who they are, what they're about, what they care about. And so social media evangelism, however you choose to approach that, is really an extension of that. I'm trying to express to people and reflect to people something about my faith, about what I believe in God, what I think are important messages to share. And so I think there's two ways you can look at that. You do that on an individual standpoint as an individual Christian, and obviously you do that as the voice of a representative of the local church. And those two things, I think, can blur to the point of sometimes it can even be a little bit dangerous to figure out how that works. And I think when we're talking about it from a standpoint of an evangelist, that can be especially tricky, because now, whether I want to or not, I no longer have a personal profile on social media. I am always going to be speaking as the perceived voice of the local church. Now, that's, in a lot of ways, that's true of a member at large as well, but specifically for an evangelist. And so we have to start, I think, thinking about the idea that everything I post is gospel evangelism, because my life is supposed to reflect that. So from every meme, every post, every recipe, every quiz, all of those things now have to be taken into that light, because I can't compartmentalize, this is my entertainment social media, this is my religious social media, this is my what recreational, whatever it may be. It all goes into one thing. And I don't think we're used to thinking about anything that way, being seen in that way. And so I think that's one of the challenges that we have to be talking about, specifically as preachers, but also just as individual Christians. What is my social brand, and how does that reflect God?
Yeah. So it kind of you have to ask a couple of questions first when you talk about what is social media, and then why does it matter? Because that's kind of our first discussion point. Social media has shifted over the last 25 years. We'll use that bracket. It's the growth of the social environment. And so first social media environment that I was part of was a closed network, BBSs, bulletin boards. You dialed in with a phone, you uploaded a file of information, you downloaded a file of information. Next phase was multiplayer game environments, playing like games like Warcraft and stuff. The very first Warcraft games were two-player multiplayer environments. And so you had a friend that you dialed your phone to, you played your game together, and you may have had text conversation or a second phone line to participate with. Then we had AOL. AOL is basically the beta version of Facebook. It had groups, chats, and news information. Facebook just makes more money off of it than AOL ever could figure out how to do, because they try to do two things at once. And so that moved to things like MySpace, and for those who are in the know, Pleonast, and beyond those kind of things, you had all the predecessors to the big social media environments now. They are basically opportunities, as I see it, to create a small group of friends. Even if you didn't have one local to you, you could create a community. And so even to now, social media serves in that same way. And you participate in it by choice to a certain degree. And once you do, like Paul was pointing out, you're totally branded by your past behaviors, because it's a permanent thing. If you upload something to the cloud, to the internet somewhere, it is metaphorically or realistically always going to be there. People will remember it, they can search for it, and they'll throw it back in your face 10 years down the road. And so understanding that helps us perceive some possibilities and some consequences. Possibilities, everybody's there. I can evangelize and share the gospel with people in ways I could never do 25 years ago. But it has consequences. When I share the gospel, I have to be much more precise with my message in this environment, because of the way in which it interacts with audiences, with what Paul, I believe, knows quite a bit about, which is search engine mechanics, and then everything else. We could say them derivatively, the Karens of the internet. That's a class or a group of personalities and behaviors. So I think that's probably a starting point, is that it's social media in some ways is a narrowed focus portion of the digital conversation environment. I think great. Francis is here. So I would probably say a couple other steps of things to think about from understanding social media and then why it matters. And especially if you talk about the top two search engines on the planet. If we want to throw Google becomes the third. The top two search engines on the planet are Facebook and YouTube.
Mhm.
Google aggregates information from Facebook and YouTube to give responses. And when people say they're going to Google something, very often they mean, I want to go search Facebook and YouTube. And the results are either going to be text-based or video-based. And we go to video-based when we want to fix something. We go to text-based for other reasons. And Facebook tends to lean more to the text meme side of the edge. YouTube obviously is a video aggregation site. And so social media fits in those contexts too. It matters because that influences public policy. It influences personal behavior, and it will positively or very negatively, and more often negatively, influence spiritual behavior. I think we talked about this ahead of time, and Paul, I think it might be good for us to talk about it right now, because you mentioned it earlier. If you put up something stupid on your Facebook page and leave it there, and your Facebook page is the representation of the local church, that's going to drive people away. Like that's like one of the unwritten realities of the internet. It's kind of like going and visiting a congregation in the Southeast, and they've got an older building and it smells old. And the people who normally worship there, they are comfortable with the old smell because they don't smell it anymore. But the new family goes, wow, this place really stinks. You want to come back here again? You can't just say, well, those people don't love the gospel well enough. I would probably say you don't love them enough to be aware of the barrier you unintentionally place between them and God. So that's just kind of an illustration of it.
Yeah. Well, and I think I want to add something to what you just said, because I feel like that's kind of where there's some things that I used to do probably 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago, that I've questioned now, in large part because, and I notice a lot of people still do this, that we will defend whatever we say based on the idea that it's not what we meant. They interpreted what I said incorrectly. And that's almost always is true. On both sides of any argument, you've got people that are misinterpreting what was intended. But that brings up a key differentiator about social media that we don't understand a lot of times, because we still think that we've been told that social media is an online conversation. And therefore, I assume that I can have an online conversation just like I would a normal conversation. But it doesn't work. You're missing tone, you're missing inflection. And also, there's an opportunity. You mentioned the idea of kind of inviting people into a group conversation. This is the equivalent of somebody walking by my conversation for a split second, and they hear something really rude that I said. They don't know the context of it. They don't know my background. They don't know why I said it. They don't realize that I probably wouldn't apply it to their situation. All they know is that they heard a comment that sounded directed to them personally. And they take that now as an indictment of the way that they specifically use social media and the way that they do all those things. And it doesn't matter that I didn't intend it that way. Chances they're going to do one of two things. They're either going to fight back and attack you. Well, three things. They might actually ask you to clarify. That's rare. And you love it when that happens, because then you can actually start a conversation. But more often, they're either going to attack you and presume your motives, or they're going to shut you out. They're just going to leave the conversation and walk away with that impression. And I think we were talking about this earlier, that we've seen that on both sides of a lot of arguments, particularly in the last couple of weeks, where people have said things, and well, if somebody misinterprets that, then that's their fault. That's their problem. Well, it may be their fault that they misinterpreted, but it's my fault that I wasn't thinking about how I could frame this in a way that is designed not to poke somebody in the eye and make them angry so that we can have an unconstructive debate, as opposed to thinking about, look, how can I say this in a way that's going to edify, that's going to have a Christ-like attitude, that is going to create opportunities for dialogue that doesn't require them to drag a whole bunch of other baggage in and have to defend a lot of ideas and concepts that really aren't under discussion at the time. You mentioned the idea of keeping your concepts on social media very concise, the idea that we don't want to have discussions that are cluttered up by a whole bunch of other things. If I want to make a point about a specific issue or a specific topic, I don't drag a bunch of stuff into here that may or may not be directly and completely and clearly related. They may, in my mind, be tangentially related, but they're going to distract the conversation onto over this thing. And I want it focused here. So any opportunity I have to have a conversation about, if I want to talk about a current event, it does not help me to then try to drag in a bunch of other things and cloud the issue and try to and give all these different ways that people can take an off ramp onto another discussion, or to feel that you are attacking my position on this because you attacked my position on this, and you've lumped them together to the point where now I feel like I got to defend this. We just get a lot of very confused, and I think as Stephen was saying earlier, we start talking past each other.
Yeah, so I would add like one more thing to think about in the sense of why this matters before we kind of move into how to make effective use of the medium. One of the things I do, if I'm going to go to a new area, I used to go person to person. When I traveled overseas to Europe, I would go talk to people and I would say, hey, where's your favorite restaurant? Where's the place you go when you want to get your favorite thing? And I would ask them personally. I'd go talk to the guy walking down the street, someone in the store. I'd go ask them. I said, tell me what you love here. I'm not from here. Tell me what you love. We don't do that anymore. I still do, but we kind of do that ahead. And we go to Yelp. When we go to Yelp, we're looking for two things. We want lots of reviews. And then if you're like me, I look at the health score. I want an A rating health score if I'm going to eat outside of my normal area, because I want to know that someone else who has a standard checked and made sure the place is clean. Do not dismiss the reality that that's what people do before they visit the church that you are part of the first time. They do that. They do that kind of stepped introduction into what's going on. So with that as kind of a backdrop, you've got to think through, what am I going to do right now?
Yeah.
How am I going to participate well in this environment in a way that really strengthens my big goals? And my big goals are to honor God and honor Jesus. And my big goals are to share that message with somebody who I might not meet in any other way. And those are kind of like the narrowed big goals that I would have. I will also add a kind of a component that is important. Opening up social media in a congregational context creates the opportunity for Christians to participate who may not be ones who are willing to lead a song, lead the Lord's Supper, teach a Bible class, because it's a new area of service that wasn't there 10, 5, 20 years ago. Paul, do you want to start talking about, I know you've got some expertise again in this area.
There's a comment I'd like to throw out there just because it goes along with what you're saying. Terry said that there are things to avoid on social media: stupid things, fake or false links, links to material that have offensive language, links to things that are inappropriate, all bad things. And so as you have, while we're still talking about kind of like this is the face that you are showing people for your local church, how would you kind of gauge that? If you're going to post a link to something, how do you decide? And maybe this would come up later in the conversation, but it seems to fit in here. How do you decide, is this dumb? Do I need to?
Well, there's a problem with that, and that is, and I agree with what he's saying in principle. The problem is, depending on your background, your education, your exposure to other people, what seems dumb to you may not seem dumb to me, either because I don't see it or because I see a different side of it. So it becomes very difficult. And I'm not saying that to excuse people from posting dumb things. If it's dumb, it is in fact dumb. But we don't always see that. And the problem is that we have blind spots. Philip, we were talking about this earlier, and you mentioned the idea of, particularly when we start talking about things like race, where those of us who are raised in a relatively insular environment don't always understand the way certain things are perceived. And we run the risk of posting things that would be viewed by people in different circles as being stupid or unrealistic or whatever it may be. I don't know, and I'm not going to know that. So the only way to fix that problem is for me to be very, very over careful in thinking about how could somebody that I disagree with, what are they going to think about this? It's going to require some empathy, and we're not all graced with that. And I would suggest to you that if you're not capable of doing that, it's really just better not to post anything at all. We have to understand that if that's a problem for us, it's better just to step away because we can do more harm than good. But, obviously there's the question about vetting, and you can get into, again, all kinds of different discussions about fact checks and which ones are valid and which ones are not. And ultimately you're going to be trusting somebody's word, regardless of which you decide to do. Whatever fact checker you do, more and more we're getting into the idea of fact checking opinions, which is never a good place to be.
Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'll just add this. The transaction in social media is credibility. That's why social media has influencers. Someone will hire them because they believe their audience will listen to their influence and buy the thing that they're now hawking on their social media Instagram channel and says, oh, buy this, it's the best thing ever. And so you have credibility. As an evangelist, that's really your only currency in the transaction on social media. Is this person coming off to me as credible? And the minute you begin selling something that is less than credible, side by side with the gospel, which is supposed to be credible, you undermine your ability to be effective in the area that matters the most to you as an evangelist. Now, if evangelism doesn't matter as much to you as it does to me, you might be willing to do some other stuff. Like maybe you're selling a product for a business through your social media channels. Great, you're using it for that purpose. And I don't look to you for the gospel then. I look for you for advice about how to buy a car. And I'm cool with that. That's actually perfectly fine. So as an evangelist, I take that into consideration a lot. And so for me, my process is I want to make sure that I'm not allowing my bias to come through with my decision to share information, factual stuff. Now, personally, when it comes to like study and research and stuff like that, I want it to actually be research, not literary review and not anecdotal information. So if it's not a peer-reviewed paper that got published and picked on, I'm probably not going to share it.
Yeah.
If it's not news that comes from a quality news source, I'm probably not going to share it. If it comes from Alex Jones, I will burn it to the ground because he is literally an entertainer, not a news reporter.
Yeah.
He creates an entertainment product. Rush Limbaugh moves into the entertainment zone, even though he deals with news. Glenn Beck, entertainment zone. All of the CNN commentators and Fox News commentators, they're in the entertainment zone as much as they are news commentators. No negatives with them as human beings, just know what you're sharing. And if you share something that looks like it come off of a Russian troll bot because it agrees with your perspective of the world, I might just give you a break and we'll snooze for 30 days. And it's okay. It's perfectly fine. But understand that you're underselling or undermining the message when you sell this less credible information.
Yeah. And I would add too that a big part of it is obviously understanding the fact that the only time you can be in true control is if you have gone in and done certain research for yourself and you've looked into things. Going back to what Philip was saying, and beyond that, you've got to trust somebody that at least is trying to give a balanced perspective of something. And I'll tell you that if you're going to, whether it's Daily Caller, whether it's Vox, whether it's Huffington Post, when you read something that is clearly intended to be an us and them article, you've already started off on that framework that you are going to be combative. You're basically telling somebody, you're in the wrong, I'm in the right, my side is right, your side is wrong, and I'm going to tell you why. And whenever you start talking about sides, you're obviously going to start alienating people. And there's a sense in which we can do that, not just in terms of sharing media, but in our own teaching as well. You know, I was talking to somebody about this, about the kinds of brochures and pamphlets we put out. And this is probably a pretty good example in terms of what we should be doing, thinking about socially. You know, if I'm putting out brochures that spend a lot of time talking about those sinners over there who won't accept that drinking is wrong, or, you know, those people that are just deluded about not understanding, why can't they figure out that they need to be baptized? That's an internal language that we're using there. And if you're using those, I'm not saying you can't use those necessarily, but they're intended for your internal group. They're not intended for you. You're not going to hand that to somebody that is in the them category and expect them to respond well, because you poisoned the well with your intentions, even if what you're saying is true. And if you're using your brochures to talk to your visitors, you're going to want to be starting a dialogue. You're going to want to be introducing some subjects without necessarily poking fingers in your chest. That same rationale, and I think we can kind of understand that a little bit, at least on the brochure side.
Yeah.
But that same thing has to be true in social media now. What is my purpose in doing this post? What is the reaction that I want to try to establish? And who am I talking to? If I'm only talking to the people that agree with me about everything, then am I really accomplishing anything in doing that? Am I just trying to get everybody as upset as I am? I don't know that that's a productive thing to do. So if I'm talking to people that disagree with me, am I trying to point out that they're stupid? Am I trying to ridicule what they're doing? Or am I trying to start a conversation? And I got to be honest about why I'm doing it, and then ask the question, does this, what I'm about to post, accomplish that? Is it in line with my goals? That's a whole lot of thinking that goes into a single post, and I'll plead guilty to not always doing that. Yeah. But
that's just a group thing.
That thought process, I think, is vital because it slows us down enough to really think about what it is that I'm doing here. Because social media is designed to help us to do things without thinking about it. And that can be a real danger to our work as evangelists, but as Christians too.
I'll add this as caveat. For me, I try not to be a single source news consumer. So I try to read the same information as presented through a variety of professional communicators. That's what news people are. They're professional communicators. And about the only thing I can legitimately research is the literary analysis of the Bible and tacos. Those are two things that I probably can confidently say I can do research. Beyond that, everything else is literary review for me, reading someone else's research and trying to make sense of it, including social media. There's limits to each of our individual capacity to understand and to do. So with all of that, making intentional choices, because your currency, your capital is trust, is credibility, and you're saying, okay, am I willing to share that with everybody who's in my audience? And my audience varies on the day, where it is, who I'm sharing, and what I'm trying to do with it.
And to your point earlier, you have just entrusted your brand and your influence and everything with whoever wrote that article. Mm-hmm. When we think, we rarely think about it in those terms because we tend to think of journalists in a lump group or a publication, the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or whatever publication it may be, and we think of them collectively. And I used to be a journalist. I used to, way back, when I first got out of college, got a journalism degree. And I can tell you, all of these people are individual human beings who have good days and bad days, who have days when they phone it in, have days when they really dig in and do the work, and sometimes where they just kind of take people's word for it and move on, and sometimes even when they have their preconceived biases that force them to tunnel vision that story. And when you understand that these people are just human beings who are trying to understand a topic that they may not understand very fully themselves, they got to go interview other people. Now, I am not only outsourcing to that, I'm outsourcing my expertise to a person who has outsourced his expertise to other people who are going to tell them so. So I'm getting third-hand information now. And when we start thinking about it from that standpoint, that ought to make us very, and I'm not trying to get into a don't trust the media rant, but when it comes to the idea that of trusting them with my reputation, I mean, how many times have we seen in the last 2, 3, 5, 10 years where the initial reports or something are very wrong, are not what they ended up being, and people have jumped the gun on a lot of things on both sides of the aisle. And we got to be, it's, what is Peter's, let every man be swift to speak, James, swift to speak, swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. That ought to be slow to tweet or slow to post.
Yeah, for sure. I kind of expand it into figuring out what to do with all this information now. I think being cautious is wise. Being careful and precise with your words is important. Understanding that they're going to have ripple effects that you did not intend causes you to be even more mindful of the Marshall Keeble principle, which is boil it down, render it to the most important parts so that you only share the most important things. And social media is an area where that is even more important. We're telling a story with every single post. I can tell a lot about a person's interests and what they love by what they share. And if someone gets really excited about something, they share about it, and that's great. Marketers spend a lot of time figuring out the quantifiable difference between a like, a share, and a comment. Those are the three forms of interaction and typical interaction. And those things all matter in the sense of how much it influenced you. Psychologists and marketers are trained to determine the value of that. So for us developing, what do we do? Like, how do we then use this medium that's kind of weird and it's very strange? I guess it was, for me, about 2.5 years ago, I talked to someone Stephen knows, Ryan Firm. We sat down and I said, look, I want to move into this digital space more confidently. I've done radio before. I was a DJ in college. I did a live question and answer show in Cookeville for a number of years. People call them Bible questions. Very comfortable with that. Being on the video screen was initially weird, but I knew it was a needful step for me personally. And so I started figuring out a path to do that. I think once you make the decision intentionally to move into the medium, you've got to make some plans so that you can be effective in it. And I know from my standpoint, that's something I really wanted to try to excitedly talk about today, because I think we can be good influencers in the midst of the trash that exists once we understand the mediums better. And I'll kind of add this. When I'm talking about social and social media, I'm talking about everything from Facebook to TikTok and Hive.io, which are both, one's really popular and one's hyper obscure. And so I think it's really important to understand that we're kind of talking about all those things. And TikTok's a thing. It's the most rapidly growing social media environment of short form video, 1 minute or less, which is a great teaching space. 1 minute conversations, it's a great teaching space. Everyone's like, oh, it's a minute. I want 30 minutes. Yes, but I'm willing to spend a minute to buy 30 minutes down the road.
Well, and I think to that point, understanding, going back to more of the marketing side, is understanding what each of those channels is, who's using it, and how they're using it. I think is pretty vital. And I'll put myself in this category that we are very slow to adapt the way that we teach to those media, in large part because we just, we're doing half a dozen jobs already, and now we have to be social media director of the church and things of that nature, and marketing director and content producer and all these other things. And it's just a whole lot easier to just do one thing and blast it out over every channel. And sometimes I kind of tend to do that, but we have to also start thinking about whether or not what I'm doing is even counterproductive in terms of mismatching content with a channel. For the most part, social media is not great for having an in-depth conversation about something. To your point, there's really not any channel on social media, with the possible exception of YouTube, where you can really engage in anything that's long form, with the exception of linking to an article if somebody wants to go read that. but having an executive summary with a single point out of that in your post. And then if you want to read more here, go click over here and read my blog post or whatever it might be. But understanding that, the 30 and in my case 45-minute sermons, you're not going to get a lot of people that are going to sit through an entire sermon when they're in social media mode, because that's not why they're there. They're there to browse through, they're to see things quickly. And the challenge is, how can I do something that will catch somebody's attention in a way that will trigger a thought process that will want them to learn more? Because I've been thinking about this a lot. We were talking about memes earlier, and a lot of times should we use memes to teach the gospel? And there's a very, very large part of me that will answer no and never. And the reason for that is that the gospel message in and of itself is to be revered, it is to be treasured, it is to be treated in a sacred way. And I don't know that it's possible sometimes to whittle the gospel down in a way that is bumper sticker worthy and do it justice. So when we're thinking about what is the message I want to give, maybe the question isn't, I got to figure out a way to get my message and cram it into 2 sentences or less and stick it on Facebook. Maybe what we're thinking about is using social media as an off-ramp to try to get them to have a real conversation about things that are spiritual in a way where, there's just not a whole lot in the gospel that is translatable in a 30-second soundbite, at least in a way that's going to start that real conversation.
I want to plant seeds with social media. That's really what I'm trying to do. And the seed might be planted in the small group that is a closed door church group, where it's everyone at Eastside or everyone at Kimberly. And so I might plant seeds there and then allow God to give increase through another waterer. Even maybe I water those seeds and God grants the increase. And so that's one use of it. Another use of it in the front facing side of things, as I'm trying to figure out how to interact interest in the gospel on the other end of the equation. How can I sow some seeds over there that make them want to come visit Eastside or come to the coffee shop and have a conversation with me? I know that it would be challenging for them to sit to listen to a 30-minute sermon by anybody. And here's my information, like a literary review. 2.5 years ago, I sat down and I determined that statistically in the United States, there's about 11,000 churches of Christ. Of all types of perspective, plus or minus, that are active in some way on a social media channel that I can kind of quantify. And so I said, well, how many of them are on YouTube? How many on Facebook are doing video? Number that I can really comfortable with, about 1,000. Well, I can go look at 1,000 internet pages. I can click and see what's going on there and do an anecdotal review. And for the most part, the viewership of sermons of every quality, every quantity, every length is you get anywhere from about 2 to 30 views. That's the aggregate numbers across 1,000 YouTube and Facebook video vendors. Even from some of the most eloquent, competent, educated communicators, you're still ending up with those numbers. There's only a few individuals and churches amongst churches of Christ who rise beyond that number. They get out of the 50 view zone. And it's a handful. And there's good reasons why they do. And actually, I called them and asked, I was like, why do you have these numbers? What are you doing? And there's simple answers. We'll talk about that in a second. So knowing that's the case, and then looking at the average viewership of videos outside of church sermon videos, at the 10-minute mark is a key minute mark for YouTube. If someone stays past 10 minutes, you've purchased their participation in some way. You may have bought it with information. You may have bought it with dollars, but you purchased their participation at that point, and they bought in, and they'll come back a second time. But you're getting that chance to sow the seed only in the first 30 seconds. You only get those first 30 seconds to say, do I want to listen to a few more minutes? Do I want to, because I look at my own behavior as the last equation. If I'm not interested, I'm done. I'm going down the hill, and there's 18 more communication possibilities for me to be interested in that compressed time. So I've got to then figure out what's a realistic goal, what's a realistic comparison, what's real from the context of the Church of the East Side, my abilities, and what I want to accomplish. I cannot make a comparison between myself and Stephen Furtick and Elevate. And I know some of the reasons why he's really popular. I can't do those things, both from a biblical standpoint, and here's the other reality. I don't have the budget to do those things. Here's a hidden reality. Many of the viewership groups that are above 1,000 are advertising-driven viewers. Someone is paying for that viewership. They're buying it. That's fine. Like, I don't have a problem with it either. Even if you want to marketize your sermons and advertise the gospel in that way, you got the budget, do it. I want the gospel out there as much as possible, but be realistic then and say, okay, this is what we're doing. Now we can track these goals. We can see the outcome. We can see what we're doing. I like to use the SMART acronym for my goal setting. SMART, measurable, achievable, repeatable, trackable goals. That's what I like to do. I want to be able to repeat the thing. It can't be magic. It has to be realistic. So I kind of think about all that in that space as I figure out what I'm going to do with social media. And can I use 30 seconds? Absolutely. If someone gives me 30 seconds, I'll take it. If they give me a minute, I'll take it. If they give me 30, I'll take it. 45, they love me.
And as you're saying that, there's a couple things that go along with that, but it makes me wonder, and I haven't done this yet, and that's something I've kind of been thinking about a little bit in terms of how a preacher is traditionally approached a lesson or a sermon, and it's the standard 3 points outline. It's the Walter Cronkite, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them, which is great. I'm wondering now whether the internet, and specifically YouTube and other things, are going to require a very different type of outline, that it's almost like a series of circles that expands out, that like to your point, I've got 2 minutes probably before 95% of people are going to stop watching. What can I say in those first 2 minutes that if they leave and that's all they got, then they didn't take a lot of stuff. They're always going to take things out of context, but they're going to get to the point. I've always kind of liked to organize things to where my punchline is at the end, and I try to pull people along. And I think that works fine with an audience that can't go anywhere. It doesn't work when you're certain. Well, and it sometimes works in a movie where I paid my money. I might as well see how it ends. But if I've lost you in that first 30 minutes, I'll probably walk out. It is incredibly easy for me to stop watching a YouTube video. I literally have to I don't even have to close my browser. I get up and walk off, or I switch to another browser. There has to be some way that I can either convince you to keep watching, or make sure that you at least got the gist of what I was trying to say in that initial first 2 minutes. I don't have the answer to how to do that. If somebody does, tell me, and tell all of us, because I think that may be a revolutionary thing in terms of the way that we market in digital marketing and on social media as well. But I think that it's important for us to be mindful of that, thinking about how people consume social media and digital as well, obviously. How can I make a message that is going to capitalize on that and is going to allow, because I actually wonder sometimes, Philip, I don't know how you feel about this, or Stephen as well, that, I spend a lot of time, I've got my recorded video, I put it on Facebook, I put it on YouTube, I put it on my website, and to your point, for maybe 5 to 10 people to see. My podcast does a little bit better than that. But at some point, do we ask ourselves the question, is the 3 and 4 and 8 hours that I'm spending on this something that I need to be doing other things on?
Mm-hmm.
We just be abandoning the whole YouTube sermon thing completely and trying to find something else.
Well, here's the research in the sense of what I've read, and literary review again, and then what I've talked to and what I think is some of the answers. But again, I don't know what I'm doing. Anyone who says they know what they're doing just knows what they did. So in that sense, what I know that some of the most watched social media accounts that come out of digital spaces of religion do is that they will have someone in their audience who's employed by the congregation to listen to the sermon. Maybe they have the notes ahead of time, and they're picking the biggest punch. What's the biggest punchline? And they will snippet that down to 10, 15, 30, or 60-second sound bites. Those are then time notated on a card or a form or a format somewhere. And so it would be like, here's Paul Hammond's sermon. His best, most resonating points seem to have taken place at 10:12 in the sermon. Make content off of that. The content off of that is then leveraged with text and visual overlays to have an achievable goal. The goal in those cases are either going to be platform specific, as in we want them to come to the assembly, we want them to support our event, we want them to contribute emotionally, spiritually, or financially. And so that's what's taking place. That's the resource basket that I know that you don't have, that I don't have, because our congregations are not 500 people, 1,000 people, 2,000 people, where you can have the math to get underneath it. So with that small snippet, that's what gets shared on social media. The whole sermon may exist on live stream, social media, and other ways that is linked in some way or not. But the driver is that then drives them to one single spot where you want them to be. Maybe it's a, hey, come visit us. Hey, come be encouraged. Because the interaction may not be as simple as, I want them to come to church. Yes, we all want that. We want them to come to the assembly of believers. But the interaction might be, I want them to come to this resolution of an idea. Or I'm trying to comfort their hearts. One of the things that I still do, I don't remember where I first learned it, I've heard it rephrased a couple of times, is that I imagine a person that I am preaching to for every single sermon. And usually it's the same imaginary person who represents the demographics of the area in which the church I'm part of exists. And so that demographic group represents the largest basket of people in the audience that surrounds the church at Eastside. And my sermon is crafted to reach them as much as it's crafted to meet me and the church at Eastside. And so I'm trying to punch in past the barriers, even in social media use now, to take that content and the sermon I preached on Sunday, there might be a line or two from it that appears in a post on Wednesday. What I used to do, and here's the flip of it, I used to use the bulletins, short form articles, as ways to introduce the ideas of my sermons. So if I was going to preach on a subject in 2 weeks, I might have 2 articles in the 2 prior Sunday bulletins that provide context for the sermon that would come on the 3rd Sunday. Now I've switched the arrangement around where I have the sermon on Sunday. Sometime in the week, there might be a post afterwards that says, here's a quote from the sermon, and boom, I'm going to use it this way in social media. Well, so that's part of my strategy, perspective.
Well, and a lot of those things, to be honest with you, I actually started doing a 3-minute takeaway when I first got here, and due to a lot of issues, including bandwidth and workload and a whole bunch of other things, it became too cumbersome. I stopped doing it, but I'm still convinced it's the way to go. To your point, being able to have a way to have something concise that you can put out there that will lead into something bigger. And I saw Terry made the point that I'm just, it doesn't take my time to live stream sermons, and that's right, it doesn't. But one of the things, and this I think leads into another idea that I think is important for us to start thinking about, is that, for example, if I go to the Kimberly Church of Christ YouTube page or the Eastside YouTube page or whatever, and I subscribe to that, I basically get all these videos. If I am a 2-minute video consumer and all that I have on here are 45-minute videos, I'm probably not going to be very interested. Now, if I have a mixture of 45 and 2, I might be interested, but it's still, I got to weed through a bunch of stuff. And it's more likely that I'm going to miss those things and pass up on them and go someplace else. And so the challenge is, even in our channels that we use on YouTube and Facebook and all these other things, even being focused upon what you alluded to earlier, and in marketing, the idea of having a persona, creating the idea of who I am trying to market to. What does he look like? What does he do? How does he consume? What are his interests? Things like that. Having a channel that is specifically designed with an outcome, a person in mind. For example, the idea, Google lets you create a whole bunch of Google accounts. And what if we, for example, we've got the Standard Church website, the Standard Church YouTube channel, and I put all my sermons there, and that's fine. What if I've got an entirely different YouTube channel that's designated to 1 minute, 2 minute, 30-second brief content that now they're not intermingled, they're not conflicting with each other. If somebody only wants 20 or 30 seconds, they're going to go here and they'll get it every single time. And they'll
It's
get
called TikTok and Instagram stories.
Exactly. Why do people go to Instagram? They don't go to read a lesson. They go to see some inspirational, pithy thing that can lead them. And so the idea of, and Terry just asked, I'm asking questions live. Can't you just create playlists? You can do that. I don't know whether people typically differentiate along that line. It's a way to try it. You might anything to differentiate those and segment them out, I think is a good plan. But at the same time, the other thing that you can avoid by doing this, at the risk of sounding like you're trying to bait and switch, but if you believe that there is a stigma attached to the term Church of Christ, or whatever, the idea of a bunch of sermons on there, well, I can see all the different playlists, and some of these are sermons, so I know what they really are. If you want to try to have a conversation that doesn't get bogged down in those things yet, you're not ready to talk about those things yet, more of an introductory to someone who has no Bible knowledge at all, I can create a channel that's geared for them. I can gear to somebody who is, there's just a lot of different ways you can do it. You're limited only by the time to manage them, the people that are involved in them. There's a lot of ways that you can refine your social media to the point where you're really talking to a specific group of people in a specific way to try to help them to understand. I wish I had the bandwidth to do that. So if you got it, I recommend trying it.
Yeah, I think of it this way. You've got to create some substance out there. There has to be substantial content of value, because people are going to come initially for pretty, but they'll stay for substance. And so, kind of touching into something I think Royce Bell mentioned, many of the content much of the content I've seen in my review of what Brethren have done with social media is low production quality. I'll say on one level, it's okay to have low production quality. You want to make sure that what you're producing, though, has quality content. That the content inside that low quality bandwidth stuff is understandable. Your audio is good. Your video is okay. And then your message is precise. It's understandable. There's some tools you can use too. I have a couple notes. Like if you really want to get into social media, find some teenagers if you don't know what they're using right now, because they're going to probably have a little bit better handle on mobile video and content editing tools like Canva. Adobe makes a couple different options. They're really good. I use a program called Hootsuite. Hootsuite allows me to schedule content for delivery, so I don't have to be there the second a post gets shared. And so that allows some efficiency of behavior. But then also learn to share. Get other people participating in the process so that they have a hand in the gospels going forth. Even if you're just asking a sister or a brother in Christ, hey, in my sermon, if I say something that really hits you, and you're really good at coming and telling me afterwards, could you write down the time that happened so I can go back to the sermon and excerpt that out and share that big point with a larger audience? Because if it affected you, it'll affect somebody else, and you're going to help somebody in that regard. I think that's kind of a way to think through the process to give that local context. Social media also allows you to kind of track a lot of this. You can see what the participation levels are. And this will come up in our discussion a little bit later today. there's some platform level buy-ins that you need to kind of reach to start taking advantage of the way that YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, etc., leverage your media outside of paid content. The first platform is about 1,000 likes on a page. The next platform is about 10,000 likes on a page. Those two metrics open up additional features in their use, but you got to buy to get there. You're going to buy with time, like Paul's talking, 8 hours, 3 hours, 2 hours making videos, doing all that stuff. Or you're going to buy with cash. Either pay someone else to do it or pay Facebook or YouTube to sponsor your post so you get those likes to get to that point where you get a aggregate influence outside of just I paid for someone to watch my video. So I think there's some processes that are there that I think we can certainly take better advantage of, and we can all keep it very localized. I'm not trying to teach per se in areas that don't speak English. And I'm really trying to reach mainly Coweta County and Fayette County because those are people I can go see. I can go talk to them. But I'll take anything beyond that as extra gravy.
You mentioned a cost.
You're muted.
I am.
Steve is asleep.
You mentioned a cost with like associated with YouTube or Facebook and things like that. And sometimes people will kind of be like, whoa, we're not going to pay to use something that's free. But we have paid, people in the past have paid to put advertisements in a newspaper or different things like that. And I mean, if we're being honest, there is a very real sense in which if you're going to pay to put ads in a newspaper today, with most people, the money would be more effectively used to generate heat than to try and buy advertisements in a newspaper. And again, that kind of depends on the community that you live in. But where I am in Nashville, I don't think putting advertisements for a gospel meeting or some kind of special service that we're having in the newspaper is effective. But putting that money into social media, that's where people are going to see it now. Buying, using ads, boosting posts on Facebook and different things like that. So kind of with that idea that this is now like the new newspaper advertisement, how would you encourage people to use that to promote things instead of just...
And this is the reality that we live in, and it makes me grind my teeth when I think about it, but the reality is that Facebook and YouTube are businesses. And they are not there because of the altruism of their heart. They're there to make money. And the reality of the matter is when I post something on Facebook, I think the number last I saw was something in the neighborhood, 2% of my followers will see that message. That is on purpose. Because if 50% of your people could see that, then you wouldn't need to advertise. Facebook wants you to advertise. As a result of that, if you want to have any real traction, sponsoring your post, boosting your post is probably something you have to do. If Facebook is your strategy, then you have to. It will not accomplish anything unless you're boosting your posts. And the same thing is probably true to YouTube. Again, we talked about the idea of, Philip mentioned the idea of buying your audience, and that's what he means by that. People aren't just going to go out unless how SEO works is that you got to be, if they're going to find my website, they either have to actually type out my name, something that's very, very specific to me, or they have to ask a question or use a key term that I have so well tied to my website that Google believes that I am a really good source to answer that question, and it will bring me up in search. 99% of church websites out there do not do that, or cannot do that, or are not equipped to do that. And so then you can do you can do ad placement and things like that basically pay Google or pay Facebook to bump you up and make sure that you get seen. There's an expense to that, and from a personal standpoint, the fact that Facebook has got my church website blocked for no apparent reason, I hate the idea of giving them money. But if you're going to be on Facebook, that's really your option. That's all you can do. And so I think to your point, the question then becomes, how do I budget that? How do I monitor to see what's working and what's not? trying different things. As Philip mentioned, 90%, I would venture to guess, of social media marketing by anybody but the top experts in the marketing firms and guys like that is basically you're just trying stuff. Did this work? Well, sort of. Well, let's try this and see what happens. It really is an experimentation, and I get that a lot of churches, particularly elderships, are not comfortable with that. But that's how social media works. It is we kind of have to play by their rules and do things in that certain way if we want to see any real results at all. I think when we start looking about that and thinking the question, I just put something out to 2% of my followers, is that, again, it goes back to, am I wasting my time having a social media presence if I've got 500 followers and 25 of them are going to see any given post that I do?
Yeah, I'll add this. It takes time to generate that momentum in a social media context. So it's not going to happen overnight. You got to be committed to the process of rising in the results. And like anything else, advertising is the long game. You're not doing it because tomorrow you're going to have 100 visitors. You're doing it because tomorrow you might reach one more person, and maybe not tomorrow, maybe the day after that. I will say on the reasonablest side, 25 years ago, the peddler in Caddo Parish in Louisiana was the #1 way to reach people because that's what you had. Now the #1 way to reach people is on their phones. Facebook marketing is relatively inexpensive. You can overuse it, but you can absolutely underuse it. And so you just got to choose, what are my big events for the year? What are the times where I really know that I want a visitor to be here? Some congregations over the years do their visitor appreciation Sunday variations, homecoming weekends, bring a guest, however you want to call it. It's all communicative, mishmash at that point. Yeah. But maybe that's the day where you want everyone there. So you angle your marketing, you angle your sermon to be visitor seeker friendly, that you're answering their deep questions. If you look at the purpose-driven church model of behavior, historically, Rick Warren and that group, they did some surveys in their communities. They asked 2 what they thought were relevant questions. What they wanted and what do they need? And they responded to in a way that I wouldn't, but I can make sense of their choices. The biggest need for that audience that surrounded that congregation, they wanted quality potty training. Okay, that's what they thought their need was. Second thing that they wanted great coffee when they went to church. Again, I would not answer their questions that way, but this is what their solution was. They hired a psychologist to teach potty training classes, and they hired and brought in great coffee. They had a coffee bar. Okay, people are going to come for that. What do? We say, oh, those horrible people, they sold the gospel with false pretenses. Yes, they did. But I won't say they're horrible people. They met their goals. Their goals were to get people there. Can I learn from their experiences and make it a more biblical response? Absolutely. I can do that same thing. I can identify what the big needs are. They say potty training. I can say what they need is family training. And what we're going to offer to them are sermons, classes, and conversations about the home that maybe they don't have because their home life growing up didn't provide for them the skills to train their children when they're young. And so now I can offer that. And what they say is great coffee, I can say as they wanted a great, comfortable experience when they come to worship. They want to be able to hear the gospel without distractions. Okay, how can I do that? How can I adjust our services, our times, our experiences to honor and glorify God and yet not violate the biblical principles that are revealed in the scripture and find a middle ground? I can meet them for great coffee on Tuesday, but I can bring them to the risen Savior on Sunday. And so I try to figure out ways to accomplish that. And maybe I'm successful, maybe I'm not, but I can certainly try more effective means. And so working in that context of digital evangelism, social media, really creates a group where they feel comfortable doing that.
I can't remember where you said this that sparked this thought, but I think one of the things that we do have to do, and I haven't done a good job of this, is to train our members and train ourselves as well in terms of how we use social media. I think that we typically we tend to be very passive, and generally people are passive when they watch content on Facebook or wherever it is. You kind of just watch, you consume it, you leave, and that's it. And in some ways, maybe that reflects the mentality of many in our worship, that we kind of sit there, we don't respond, we don't say amen, we don't really nod along, we just kind of sit it and we take it in, and we're very passive about that. And the problem with that is that social media, we talked about how often Facebook shares your content. Well, Facebook is more inclined, and YouTube and Google are more inclined if they think people like it, if they think people are engaged in it and engrossed in it. And so all of a sudden, the idea, I think I mentioned this last week, but the idea of a like or a share or whatever, or a comment or whatever it may be, is no longer about, well, the preacher just wants to have his ego stroked by hearing people say amen or whatever it is. And maybe that's true, but there is a real way in which every like, every share, every comment, all of those things build the credibility of the message that you're giving out. And so a lot of that, I think, of being effective on social media, getting, as Philip mentioned, getting people who are comfortable in that media to be champions, to be ambassadors of the brand on social media, and letting them do what they do in a context that's genuine and relevant, and it's them broadcasting what they care about, and getting our members to respond in such a way that they are, if I've got 400 members at a church and I got 21 followers on my Facebook page, what does that tell me? It tells me that why would I care about you when your own members don't care? Why am I listening to this? Social media in general is like a click. If you're active on social media, whether it's amateur productions, posts that are poorly written, content that nobody, all these things, if I see that, your credibility goes down with me immediately. So when I see somebody, like it or not, whether that's right or fair or whatever, that, I've got a post that got 400 likes and a post that got 10, I'm going to look at that and say that's more valuable, because that's human nature. And we'll get, we have some of our brethren who are champions on social media, who are, you want to call them almost ambassadors, they're leaders in their forum. You got guys like, and this is not a shot at all, guys like Doy Moyer, who I know, if he and I posted the same exact thing, Doy will get 300 likes and amens, and that is amazing. You are fantastic, and I'll get nothing. And that's not a bitter remark. That's just the reality of how we perceive certain brands of certain people's social media. As Philip mentioned, that takes time to develop that. But the only way to develop it a lot of times is get people conditioned to the idea that it's okay to like something if you like it. It's okay to share something if you share it. It's not, you don't have to play it close to the vest. If you thought that was a great point, say it was a great point. And getting it over the idea that this is not about bumping up this person's personality. This is about finding ways to make what he said more relevant to people, if indeed I think that it's relevant. So,
yeah, I think it's a lot of this again. Doy has ages of learning to write concisely. Ages and ages. He's really old.
Yes.
But
we only say that because we know he's not watching. But
yeah, or do we? Maybe he's snuck in the door.
I'll tag him.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Now he's going to get tagged. And
right the timeline. But here's the thing. It varies greatly with the Do the Work programs that Terry and I labor together with. Some of them, the viewership across all platforms for a single episode is 2,000 views with a lot of minutes of watching. Some of them, it's much smaller, maybe 200 to 400 views across all mediums. And that's okay, because the focus of that material may have been more narrow. We're not comparing ourselves to high-level, highly invested programs. We're comparing ourselves to the standard we set when we began. Do we help young preachers, new preachers, and experienced preachers learn to do the work better. If we meet that goal, then one view is sufficient for us, because the views aren't the metric we're looking for. We're looking for, is the content worth sharing? And then once we do that, everything else after that is worthwhile. In the comparison between Doy and I, Doy shares stuff. Some of the stuff that he thinks is really important gets 20 shares. And some of the stuff that he thinks is good but not as important as the other stuff will get 40 shares, 80 shares, 400 likes. There's not a real correlation between it, because it depends on the mood of the audience at the time he shares the thing. And that's okay too. These are all factors that we're dealing with. And by the way, to put this in realistic terms, amongst the body of Christians that I'm familiar with, we're dealing with such a thin micron of internet use that it is really not statistically significant by any advertising context. One of the largest media investment settings that I know of where Christians spent to advertise a product still only reached about 30,000 views, and they paid for those 30,000 views. And it was great quality content, well produced, with clear, understandable goals. So I think it's just kind of important for us to, again, be realistic with a lot of this stuff and come down to a practical reality. In the end, what we're trying to accomplish is a face-to-face conversation between one believer and one seeker. Everything else then is secondary to that. If we're talking about evangelism, if we're talking about exhortation and encouragement and growth, it's a different conversation. But from the evangelistic side, we're trying to produce that outcome. And everything else should be set to the back burner when that's our measurable, achievable, repeatable, trackable goal. How many face-to-face conversations did we get?
I like that. To put something maybe in a biblical perspective, for me, something that just really shocked me one day in reading, Romans 16, where Paul goes through and he lists all those names. Somebody suggested one time, I forget who it was, that may have been most of the Christians at Rome. And when you think about this man who gave up, that prestigious position in Judaism, who gave up the crowds, everybody wanting to hear Saul teach the Torah, and now here he is throwing his life out for a handful of people, in Rome. I like the way that you framed that this isn't about getting 30,000 views, about getting 100 shares. It's about getting that one person in a face-to-face conversation. And if that's all that ever happens from all the social media stuff that we do, then it was worth it.
Yeah.
I think that's powerful. Thank you for that. I think that's powerful.
Well, and I think to go along with that, the great thing about social media is also, the bad thing about social media is also the great thing about social media, in that it's always there. It has a shelf life. So the idea, again, of planting seeds, the idea, if I'm putting that out there, and I get caught up in this. I go to the metrics and we could have a whole other discussion about analytics, but why has nobody seen this? And there's different things that you can do, experimenting, looking at your times of day and figuring things out to try to optimize that. But at the end of the day, it is a seed that is waiting and is now on your timeline, and it is available for search, and it's available for somebody who just finds you 5 years later and may see that post. The question is it something that you want them to see 5 years from now? It goes back to our original question. But if it is, the great thing about that is now you created a wealth of material that's all there and waiting for that person that eventually needs to hear that sermon or needs to see that or whatever it may be. It's kind of like how we're supposed to preach the gospel, the idea of scattering the seeds. I don't know what's going to happen with that. Maybe nothing will happen, but maybe the one person that needs to hear it, God can send them to there and allow them to see that. It's, the one thing we haven't really talked about in this is how God works through social media. And I don't see any reason to believe that he doesn't any more than, I remember the story about a guy and maybe this is just an old preacher story that somebody made up and has passed on from generation to generation, but there's a story of a guy who he wrote a he did his newsletter, his weekly bulletin, and of course it's typical bulletin that never gets read by anybody. And he, at some point, I forget how it happened, but one of his visitors apparently picked one up and walked off with it. And he said, and he got a call from somebody halfway across the country who had said that they had found it in a garbage can somewhere and picked it up and looked at it. And I'll look at it later. They went home, they started looking at it, and they saw something that triggered. And I wanted to reach out to that person, and that person eventually obeyed the gospel. Now, I hope that's a real story. I think it probably is, and I have no doubt that there's some divine work, some providence that is involved in that. Well, how much more so is there divine providence in the person who comes home from a really, really bad day and really needed to see that message today, or whatever it might be. I think the idea of putting something out there, I'd say this a lot because of my marketing background. I think Philip has alluded to it too. That idea that, well, is it really worth the time? And the fact that I'm still doing it clearly tells me that I think it probably is, because you just don't know. And you know that God can use these things just like he uses everything else. We just got to make sure that it's out there and available for people to find, and have an idea of what we want to do once they do find it. What am I going to do when somebody responds to my post? What am I going to do when somebody messages the church Facebook page? When we actually get somebody that responds, and half the time it's going to be negative. Do I have a strategy in place as to how I'm going to deal with that? And what we're going to do in a way that's constructive. It's not, you just don't love God and alienate them in that way. How do we have our online conversations? That gets into a whole other question in terms of how we discuss things online. But all of these things, ultimately, we do the best we can. We get the word out there however we can. If we don't match the content in the channel, at the end of the day, it's not good, but it's better than nothing. So we at least we're trying things.
Last time I was in the Philippines, I met Christians who were interested in the gospel because they found a tract in their village, and no one, this particularly didn't know how he got it. They was just one of the persons handed it to him, and it was a tract I would never personally use. Like, it doesn't match my method of delivery. It's not one that I would choose if given the choice, this tract or another tract. Like, I wouldn't use that one because it doesn't come off as genuine to me. But that Christian I met was interested in the gospel because of a device that I wouldn't use. And so it's just kind of a general reminder in the big sense of, look, we can be effective. And if you're not comfortable in social media, that's okay too. Like, find your media context where you can be effective is another thing that I think is super important. And not all evangelists want to learn to work in that medium, and not all teachers want to learn to work in that medium. And that's okay as well. I think that's another factor of this, that if your congregation doesn't have the means, method, or opportunity to really invest in this area, okay, it's okay. Get out and sow the seed. That's really the imperative that's underneath it, in a way that effectively leverages who you are in God's kingdom. 12:23. Do we have a time frame on this stuff?
No, we can.
I hear Tacos calling me from the distance.
Yeah, we can stop this now,
Wait,
because
what?
I think we're to the point where anything else that we would mention would really, overflow into the discussion about digital media in general. I guess I like the way that you guys kind of laid out a plan for people who want to do this. And I really like the metric, because when we start talking about stuff, that's what people want to know. Is this effective? Is this working?
Mm-hmm.
And, just like you may preach 100 sermons in a year, 100 sermons in the year, and maybe out of all of those sermons, nobody responded for a whole year, but you're putting ideas in people's minds that maybe next year, when there is some kind of movement, that's what you're after. You're after that one person. And if you can get to that one person, then it's a success. I really appreciate that. Thank you guys for joining me, for being here. And we'll be back at 1 p.m. Central Time, so that's 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And we're going to talk about digital media evangelism. So it's a much broader topic. Do you guys have any closing thoughts?
No, just appreciate the discussion. I'm listing all the things in my head that we're talking about that I need to actually be doing. Again, that's, it's finding the time and prioritizing and figuring out what works for you and what matches your personality or the church's personality. And I think we talked about this last week. Just being social media requires that you be genuine. You can't fake something. You can't be something you're not, because people will figure it out eventually, or it just will come across from the beginning as being phony. So again, to your point, if you're not comfortable with it, don't do it. It's better to not do it than to destroy what credibility you already have.
Yeah, I'll just drop that. I'm wordy. I use lots of words. If something I said didn't come off in a clear, understandable way, feel free to send me a message. I'll be happy to try to re-explain it a second, third, fourth, or fifth time, because the fault probably lies on me.
I love that you clarified that, by the way, by saying I'm wordy. I use lots of words.
Yeah, that's right.
2 words? No, I'm wordy. It's not enough. It's not enough.
All right. Thanks, guys. We'll see you back at 1 o'clock.
All right. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.